Hello and welcome back. This is going to be the second installment of the Impressions podcast, and today we have the privilege of talking about The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So the edition I've got here in front of me is an ebook. This book is public domain and it is freely available online. So I went via Project Gutenberg at gutenberg.org. And the version I have here is produced by Alex Cabal and transcribed by Project Gutenberg, Australia. So without any further ado, let's get into The Great Gatsby. So Great Gatsby is not a long book. This PDF is only 70 pages long. Now, this PDF, is not, a page in a PDF is not the same in this case as a page in a book. A page here is about 2.5 pages, as I imagine it would be in a book. But all in all, we're still only talking about the equivalent of 160 pages. We're probably only talking about 4 hours. And this does read quickly, although I think it's good not to read it all at once. I think it's good to take small breaks. And I think it's helpful. It's structured into chapters, and the chapters are just kind of the ideal chapter length. Each one is about 9 pages, there are 9 of them. So you can imagine breaking a 4-hour book into 9 chapters. You got about 25 minutes per chapter. It's the perfect length. And it really allows you to sit with whatever F. Scott Fitzgerald is talking about. So obviously, The Great Gatsby, very, very famous book. But what's it like? I think broad picture, without any spoilers, without talking about the plot, what's the general gist of it in terms of its mood and its style? Well, it's definitely not. I know last episode I talked a little bit about El Señor Presidente by Miguel Ángel Asturias, which is very imagistic. It's got this kind of European modernism. F. Scott Fitzgerald's very much got an American modernist sensibility in that he is to the point and he's more observant than he is poetic. There certainly are moments of poetic description of images. He doesn't shy away from that like some American authors do. So it's not a dry book by any means. But I don't think the images are really the point of this book. I think instead it's really these kind of observations, particularly about characters and particularly about the character of Gatsby. So obviously it's called The Great Gatsby. So this Gatsby's got to be important, right? But I think Gatsby really is the heart of this book. And I think this book is just a long way of elucidating who this Gatsby character is. And I think the Herreweghe character, the main narrator, right? It's not narrated by Gatsby. It's narrated by sort of an onlooker who comes to know Gatsby. And I think that character is important in providing an audience surrogate so that we can observe with him the heart of the book, which is Gatsby. So, all of that said, I don't want to talk about generalities anymore. I'm going to talk specifically about a couple of quotes. So I'm going to choose one quote from each chapter. Now, I only did 3 for the Asturias, but the Asturias, they were very long, imagistic ideas. Here, it's short, punctual, and powerful observations. So they won't take us long to read, and I think they won't require so much description because that's the beauty of them. They have a certain power just in the way that they're expressed. So, first chapter. Our main character, Nikolai, is attending a sort of party is too strong of a word, just kind of a get-together with some people that he knows. Namely, he knows them through Daisy and Tom, who are this couple who are kind of probably 2 of the most important characters in the book. Outside of Gatsby, they're probably the 2 most important characters, maybe even more important than the narrator. So he's at this sort of get-together, and at a certain point, Daisy decides to, I guess, compliment him because he's there, and for whatever reason, the turn of conversation had kind of gotten distracted, right? And so Daisy says the following: "I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he?" Okay, so that's not the quote, but that's the lead-in, and then this is the line immediately after that from Nick, very next paragraph. "This was untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose." And that's not a quote, that's an internal monologue. And I think that's really quite funny. And it shows that Fitzgerald's got a sense of humor. And I think a lot of the great observationalists, if that's a word, the great writers who are good at observations. I mean, the people I think of, at first person people I think of are Twain and Dickens. And what are Twain and Dickens excellent at? Well, in addition to writing observations, they've got a real talent for humor, but it's not a humor that belittles. It's a humor that is knowing. And humor, when used correctly, I think, or at least humor when it's the most effective to me, is when it's used in service of elucidating some sort of idea, some sort of truth. Right? There's a quote by Antonio Tabucchi in his book Prayer Maintains, excellent book. It's something along the lines of philosophy pretends to consider only the truth, but perhaps it deals only in fiction, whereas fiction pretends only to deal with fantasies, but perhaps it expresses the truth. And I think that's the case here with the observationalists. They're able to use humor to express truth through their observations. And this the idea that, this compliment is completely ludicrous and everyone knows it's ludicrous and it's not being commented for its truth. It's being commented as a sort of social nicety, but in a positive way, in a way that's kind of turning the conversation and expressing something kind to somebody else. So that's my selection from the first chapter. Let's talk about the second chapter. So the second chapter, this one's way towards the end well, it's kind of in the middle. I spoke too soon. So this is at another party. So you'll notice a pattern. A lot of parties in this book, and this specific party occurs with people that our main character of Nýykaway he doesn't really know them very well. So it's people who are close to the mistress of Tom. So, like I said, Tom and Daisy in the first chapter, Tom has a mistress in New York City, and they're at a party involving Tom's mistress, who's a woman by the name of, I believe, Mrs. Wilson. She's married, right? So it's a whole thing. But in this case, because he doesn't feel comfortable, our narrator gets drunk, badly drunk. He's not really making much sense, but there's this wonderful, wonderful line. And I'll just read it to you cold. Here it is. When I came back, they had both disappeared, so I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either it was terrible stuff or the whiskey distorted things, because it didn't make any sense to me. And again, there's something blunt about this. It's humorous. The first one's humorous in the sense that it's blunt and it's refuting something that comes earlier. This one it's got that same bluntness. So there's that common thread, that sort of American bluntness. That's a hallmark of good American literature. But on top of that, there's this edge of, how to put it, the fact that I mean, this at this point, anything can be written. Anything can be. This is just recollections, dim recollections of a party from a long time ago, and this is the thing that our narrator remembers. So, do with that what you will. We're going to move on to the third chapter now. Third chapter. Now we start getting into the Gatsby sections, and Gatsby is a great, great character. And I'm not even going to introduce this, but it's just briefly. This is the first conversation that our narrator has with Gatsby, and this is a description of Gatsby's body language. He smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole eternal world for an instant, and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. And I think that there's something just beautiful about that. And what's, I think, notable is when it's time to describe something beautiful, something genuine, and something touching, Fitzgerald uses beautiful language. Right? I mean, this is a very eloquent and There's no sense of cynicism or sarcasm here. It's completely heartfelt, almost sentimental. And I think that it's a mark of a good author that they're able to modulate their tone for important moments like this, where you cannot undercut them with um, sarcasm or humor, because that would cause the entire sense of connection to drop in an instant. So this is really, really good stuff. Let's move on to chapter 4. So chapter 4, it's literally the last, I think it might be the last paragraph in the entirety of chapter 4 that really got to me. Yes. So this is talking, again, we're talking about our narrator who's talking with Gatsby. So Gatsby has a passion in a long ago life for Daisy, of Daisy and Tom. And so for him, this kind of long lost romance is a motivating force throughout his entire life, even though he hasn't seen her in 5 years. It he's a romantic, right? Our narrator is not. He has a girlfriend, I guess you could say. That's kind of generous because they don't even seem to like each other that much, to be perfectly honest with you. Um, but I think this is a great line which illustrates that in a much more direct and effective way than I just did. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices and blinding signs, and so I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms. I don't think anything more needs to be said about that one. I'm going to move to chapter 5. Let's see, chapter 5. Yes. And this is a good line. This is a good line. So at this point, he meets Daisy. Gatsby and Daisy meet. Herreweghe kind of arranges this for them. And now they're going around Gatsby's elaborate ornamental big house mansion thing. And Daisy's looking around. And this is the description that Fitzgerald gives regarding how Gatsby takes this. He hadn't once ceased looking at Daisy, and I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. Again, nothing more to say. That's the beauty of a good author. There's no analysis that you can add to it after a point because they've already said whatever it is they want to say with exactly the number of words it requires, no more, no fewer. So let's move on to the next chapter. We're all the way to chapter 6 now. So all the way up to page 40 in this PDF. Again, like I said, only 18 pages, so we're more than halfway through this PDF. And this, I'm going to read a pretty long passage, and this is a conversation that is held between the narrator and Gatsby after. So Gatsby holds these big elaborate parties at his place, and this is the description that's given of their conversation afterwards. This starts with Gatsby speaking. She didn't like it, he said immediately. Of course she did. She didn't like it, he insisted. She didn't have a good time. He was silent, and I guessed at his unutterable depression. I feel far away from her, he said. It's hard to make her understand. You mean about the dance? The dance? He dismissed all the dances he had given with a snap of his fingers. Old sport, the dance is unimportant. He wanted nothing less of Daisy than that she should go to Tom and say, I never loved you. After she had obliterated 4 years with that sentence, they could decide upon the more practical measures to be taken. One of them was that, after she was free, they were to go back to Louisville and be married from her house, just as if it were 5 years ago. And she doesn't understand, he said. She used to be able to understand. We'd sit for hours. He broke off and began to walk up and down a desolate path of fruit rinds and discarded favors and crushed flowers. I wouldn't ask too much of her, I ventured. You can't repeat the past. Can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. And in that single line, I think you learn everything you need to know about the character of Gatsby. He is that romantic. He is that sentimental character who's unable to let things go. But whereas for many people, that would be a flaw. And in some case, it is a flaw. I mean, this is in some sense a tragedy. Yet, you get the feeling that if the character of Gatsby did not have that trait, he would be not only a much less interesting literary character, but a worse person. There's something incredibly important, integral to the man, to the man. But again, I don't want to add too many words because you don't want to mess up a good thing. So now we move to, let's see, page 43. Oh, and this is a good section. This is where Tom finds out that Gatsby and Daisy were a thing and are now planning to elope. Sort of complicated, but they're kind of going down that path. So Tom finds out, and there's this big and elaborate thing that comes after, but this is the moment he finds out. She says an offhand remark. "You always look so cool," she repeated. This is the key line. She had told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw. He was astounded. His mouth opened a little, and he looked at Gatsby and then back at Daisy as if he had just recognized her as someone he knew a long time ago. Actually, a single offhand remark. And that often is how it is. Single offhand remark. And that's the straw that breaks the camel's back. All of a sudden, all of the pieces where you have an inkling of something, but you don't quite want to see it. There's a point at which, on a dime, the entire thing shifts. And that happens for Tom right there. Just 2 chapters to go, 2 quotes to go. Page 56. Is this page 56? Yeah, page 56. This is great. So there's a whole enormous bit of plot that happens between page 43 and page 56 in this PDF. I am not going to spoil what happens. That is up for you to decide. Suffice it to say, there is some conflict and a falling out of sorts. And these are the parting words that our narrator gives to Gatsby. There's a conversation that happens first, and then this is what Fitzgerald says. "We shook hands, and I started away. Just before I reached the hedge, I remembered something and turned around. 'They're a rotten crowd,' I shouted across the lawn. 'You're worth the whole damn bunch put together.' I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him, because I disapproved of him from beginning to end. First he nodded politely, and then his face broke into that radiant and understanding smile, as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact all the time." That's another, I mean, that's also how things are. Many of the memories I have, and I imagine many people have, are of, sometimes they're people you care quite deeply about, sometimes they're people who you know very little about, will never meet again. But there's something about that moment of expressing genuine respect. Someone else respect, you know, promoting a sense of genuine respect, heartfelt respect, or you doing the same for somebody else, that has an emotional power that ordinary interactions cannot have. And I think this quote, again, the strength of Fitzgerald is the brevity. Everything that needs to be said is said in that one line. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together. Nothing more needs to be said. Final quote. This one, there will be some spoilers here. But okay, if you know anything about The Great Gatsby, you probably know that by the end, The Great Gatsby is not kicking anymore. So there's a funeral. Herreweghe attends this funeral, but for the most part, nobody attends this funeral. Um, Herreweghe goes around trying to get people to attend the funeral, but they all push him off. So he comes to the graveyard with the dead man's father, and all of a sudden he sees this man he saw only once at one of Gatsby's parties, who was just a weird side character who never did anything. Was drunk out of his mind at the party. I think he drove a car into a ditch. I mean, just weird guy. But here's what Fitzgerald says. I'd never seen him since then. I don't know how he knew about the funeral, or even what his name was, or even his name. The rain poured down his thick glasses, and he took them off and wiped them to see the protecting canvas unrolled from Gatsby's grave. I tried to think about Gatsby then for a moment, but he was already too far away, and I could only remember, without resentment, that Daisy hadn't sent a message or a flower. Dimly I heard someone murmur, "Blessed are the dead the rain falls on." And then the owl-eyed man said, "Amen to that," in a brave voice. We straggled down quickly through the rain to the cars. Owl Eyes spoke to me by the gate. "I couldn't get into the house," he remarked. Neither could anybody else. "Go on," he started. "Why, my God, they used to go there by the hundreds." He took off his glasses and wiped them again, outside and in. "The poor son of a bitch," he said. Again, one line. Poor son of a bitch. That's everything. That tells you everything Fitzgerald needs to say. So I'm not going to say anything more about The Great Gatsby. I cannot claim to be an expert on it. I've read it once, and it's literary classic. But I hope that you've enjoyed these few quotes that I found interesting. I'm going to take a break. After this, I'm going to get back with some movies, some music, and a podcast. Until then, bye. Okay, so let's talk about the other things. So I think I'm going to start with the movies, and I'm going to start with, in keeping with the Hitchcock theme from last episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about Vertigo, another Alfred Hitchcock film. This one I think is very interesting. So Hitchcock in general feels fairly dry to me, or academic is maybe the better way to say it. He's very clearly a good technician. He's great at pacing. He's great at accomplishing suspense. Right? He's the master of suspense, fairly. I think, though, some of his movies that I've seen, at least the few that I've seen, so I'm thinking, going back to last week, Dial M for Murder, for instance, there's something about them that feels a bit too pristine. That's not the case with Vertigo. Vertigo feels loose, as though it's being made in a way that isn't so fastidiously concerned with every detail. And I think that's refreshing compared to previous Hitchcock movies, because there's never going to be a Hitchcock movie that's not technically well made. And this is no exception. But that added bit of looseness, that added bit of flexibility, and there's just a certain way the shots flow. For example, the point of view shots, right? There's lots and lots of point of view shots, but they're not done in a mannered way. They're very, very natural when you see them, and they make complete sense. There's no sense that you're watching a movie that is artificial. They feel completely correct in the moment. And I think that's the real strength of Vertigo as a whole. I did watch it, and I know its reputation is quite high, but watching it, it's clear to me that there's a reason this is set apart from the other Hitchcock movies. It just has that verve, that character, that confidence. Now, all of that said, I think the movie is broken basically into two parts, which are not at all the same length. So the pacing is a little curious. So the first part is all the way up to the famous scene in the tower. I won't spoil too much about what happens there. The next part follows what happens in the tower. I'm increasingly coming to believe that what happens after the tower is really the meat of what Hitchcock is trying to say, in all caps, right? Say, what's his message? But I find the first part more compelling, as I did with Dial M for Murder, as I did with Rear Window. I think this is a pattern with Hitchcock. I like his beginnings more than I like his endings. Partly because I was not expecting it to resolve the way it did at all. Nevertheless, it kind of works. And it's quite interesting to think about. So it's a good thinker, and a very, very well-made movie. So I would recommend watching it. I will watch it again at some point, and perhaps I'll have a better handle on it now that I know where the story is going to go. So that's the first movie I watched. Second movie I watched was Inside. That's the Bo Burnham Thing. I don't know if it's a movie, I don't know if it's a comedy show, it's just a thing. And that's from 2021, I think. Maybe 2020. Right? I mean, it was obviously filmed during the lockdown. I don't remember when it was released. I think it was released in 2021. Either way, it's interesting. Interesting, right? So it's functionally a really long music video with basically an entire album of comedy songs. Now, comedy songs, that sounds like a bad genre, but there's some good comedy songs. I think of, like, Flight of the Conchords, for instance. And these songs are as competent, if not more competent, than the Flight of the Conchords standard. So it passes the comedy songs threshold. So the comedy songs are good. The album is decent. There are a couple of standout songs. I really like That Funny Feeling, which is a classic. The Phoebe Bridgers version is better than Bo Burnham's, though. And the internet one, I forget what it's called. Welcome to the Internet, I think. That's a good one, too. And well structured. There's a really nice B section in 3. It's really nice, really well made song. Then there are bits between the songs. So this is what separates it from a music video or a comedy routine, in that there are almost like confessionals. It's like you're watching, I don't know, Survivor or something, where there are all these confessionals at points in between. I don't know how I feel about this. I get that's the point of the movie, right? The thing, right? Inside would not work without these confessionals. Or if you got rid of them, it would be a completely different thing. I get that. Nevertheless, I think when it comes to movies, when it comes to music, there is something to be said for discipline, right? Even the histrionic composers, right? Even Beethoven or Bruckner or Mahler, they still had some degree of restraint. However small, they still had some degree of restraint, whereby they would tell you how they felt, they would tell you what the world was like through their music. This is the same thing that's true of authors, right? At least those who aren't writing, autobiographies or memoirs, right? They tell you how they feel and what they think about the world through whatever it is they've written, right? And there's a confidence in that. And I get that the confessional style is meant to make us relate to whatever Bo Burnham is going through. But there is some element of it that feels undisciplined. It feels like watching a video blog on YouTube. It feels too easy, right? It's too easy to gin up sympathy by sitting in front of the camera and saying, I'm falling apart, and, weeping openly. Which, look, I don't want to knock that. There is something to be said for weeping openly and being honest and bearing your soul. But something about the way it is in this picture rubs me a little the wrong way. There's just something about it that feels cheap somehow. As though he lacks the confidence in his ability to do art, right? In the sense that he doesn't trust the art to express what he wants to express. And I don't know. I feel like that's what makes an artist great, is that they can, through some abstract art or something that's removed from their present situation, they can express the way they feel, and we know exactly what they mean. But it's done in a sort of classy, refined way. And I didn't feel that way about this. But whatever. Something's to be said for Confessional. It wasn't bad, and some of the songs were good. So I think parts of it are worth watching. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who like the entire thing. Those are the movies. Now let's talk about the podcast. Long podcast, something like 3.5 hours. Very, very famous podcast from Britain. Well, by I say very famous, I mean it's top 10 in Britain. So I guess the British like their nerdy history podcast. So this is The Fall of Civilizations. And this episode I listened to was Carthage. And what struck me about this one, I'm not going to go into too great of detail here, but what struck me about it, and I'm focusing more on the source, on the material in it than the actual presentation. Because the presentation's great, not much to say about it other than, it's just good stuff, right? I could analyze it, but I'm not going to. I'm going to talk more about the actual material. So the one story from Carthage I found most interesting was this story of the circumnavigation of Africa. So that's part of it. But then there's a sort of tidbit on the end whereby a group of Phoenician explorers go the other way around Africa. So the first way they go through the Red Sea, the second way they go around, through the Strait of Gibraltar. And they get all the way down to, I think, Cameroon, somewhere around there. They see all these volcanoes, all that fun stuff. And then they get to this island, right? And on this island, they encounter what they call gorillae. That's the original Latin, because again, there aren't really any Carthaginian Phoenician texts that are available because the Romans burned it all down, and that's actually quite sad. And it kind of, there is a part of it that prejudices me profoundly against the Romans. It's quite upsetting, I think, to think that the one thing that you'd think us humans could agree on is that knowledge is good, and that learning things about the world and producing art and all of that good stuff is good. And so the act of burning a library is just horrific to me. Anyways, that happens. We don't have any Phoenician texts or Carthaginian texts, Phoenician texts from Carthage, but we have lots and lots of Roman texts talking about them. And in the Roman texts, they call it, Latin obviously, gorillae, right? So obviously we're thinking of gorillas. And what strikes me is just, it's so interesting how they describe these gorillae, right? Because they describe them as people, right? This is olden times. This is, 500 BC or something stupid old. Because this is before really the Romans, they're writing this way after the fact, this historical document about the gorillae. And to these explorers, the gorillas, or monkeys, whatever they actually were, we're not entirely sure. We know they had lots and lots of fur, so I'm going to go with gorillas. But whatever it is that they encountered, they thought they were people, and they were perplexed that these people would not communicate with them, and that when they took some of them, because in these days, as in many days, explorers would take captives, which is highly dubious, but okay, they took captives. They took 3 gorillas captive. Unfortunately for them, gorillas do not like being captive, and so they proceeded to cause a ruckus and beat up a bunch of people, and so the explorers had to kill them. And so they kept their hides, and that's how we know that they were definitely not people, because people do not have gorilla hides. Anyways, so these gorilla people hide things, right? Gorillas. It's just very interesting how unfamiliar these explorers were with them, and how they considered them to be people like us, and how just completely baffled they were by them. And there are lots of little anecdotes like this. Obviously, the story of Dido, right? Dido and Aeneas, that's brilliant. That's pretty much all I knew about Carthage from the Aeneid. And that shows up here, and Dido is great. One of the great historical, semi-historical figures ever. Brilliant. Then you got Hannibal, one of the great historical figures ever. And there's just lots and lots of little anecdotes in here that are very, very interesting. Like Hannibal, right? In order to cross that last section of the Alps, he, does this thing where he cools and then heats the rock. And it causes it to expand in places, and that helps him chisel it into stairs. I got that wrong, but it's something like that. My favorite one is when he has the elephants, and he has to get them across the Rhone in Switzerland. And he makes these rafts, but the elephants still won't get on them. So then he covers the rafts with dirt, so the elephants are convinced that they're actually standing on land, on little islands, and he pushes them across, and that's how he gets all the elephants across. There are lots of little anecdotes like that are just wonderful. So I highly recommend this podcast just for the anecdotes, and you'll get history with it too, but lots and lots of interesting little tidbits that I'm sure they'll pop back into my mind over the next however long period of time. So those are the movies, the podcast. Now, 2 pieces of music. One of them is a little bit of a cheat. It's a lot of pieces of music. So let's start with the one that's just one piece of music. That is the second piano concerto of Nikolai Medtner. I think that's how you say it. So Nikolai Medtner, he's only known nowadays as a composer of piano music, and he's basically known as off-brand Rachmaninoff, right? off-brand Rachmaninoff. He was a good friend of Rachmaninoff, so it makes sense. But I am going to claim that his piano concerto certainly resembles those of Rachmaninoff, but there's a certain... It's funny to say because it's a very, very romantic work, but there's just this hint of neoclassicism. There's just this little, like, separation between sections where it's one idea, one mood, then it's another one, then it's another one. It's this kind of block style of writing that, Schubert and Mozart did. And I think that the piano concertos this reminds me most of are not Rachmaninoff at all, but, well, okay, it reminds me of those too, but the ones it really reminds me of that I have not seen mentioned very much are Poulenc, the C-sharp minor piano concerto, and Scriabin. I don't know how to say it. Scriabin? Yeah, Scriabin and Poulenc. They're piano concertos. Because some of the later movements are kind of featureless, like the weaker movements of Scriabin, or maybe like Pejacevich or Atterberg, kind of just late romantic stuff. But the first movement is excellent. One of the great piano concerto movements. I think it's as good... Well, okay. I don't know if it's technically as good as anything Rachmaninoff wrote, but there are some really great sections. And it's just odd. And that's what's wonderful about it, is it's got this bizarre opening with this weird trembling rhythm that just is electric. One of the best openings of any piece of music ever. And it keeps up the quality. There's a good second theme, there's a good development section, there's a great recapitulation, there's a coda, there's a cadenza, there's everything in it. And it's really the complete shebang. Highly, highly recommend as a counterpart to Rachmaninoff. I still also think Poulenc is competitive with it, although Poulenc also drops off quite a bit after its opening. But Poulenc, also one of the great openings in classical music. But Medtner, I've listened to some of his stuff. His piano music is good, but not like that remarkable. To me, he's kind of like, he's to piano music what, like, what's the guy's name who did the Enchanted Lake, Lyadov. What Lyadov is to orchestral music, Metner is to piano music, sort of. Although Metner obviously has a bigger role in piano music than Lyadov does in orchestral music. But he's kind of that similar sort of writer of miniatures, very good miniatures, by the way. Like, they're not bad miniatures by any means, but they're not like, I'm not going to get up one day and the first thing I think of is I must listen to Medtner. It's just kind of something that's in the back of my mind every once in a while. I'll remember it. But I don't want to forget this. This is a good piece of music, good piano concerto. Final piece of music. So, obviously this year is 2025, and it's a year for good anniversaries. Just last week I talked about the anniversary of Beethoven's late quartets, which we're going to continue as the others hit their performance dates. But I want to go back further. I want to go back all the way to 1725. And to go back to 1725, I'm actually going to cheat and go back to 1724, because over the course of, let's see, about a year, I'd say, year and a half, something of this order, Bach wrote a bajillion cantatas. He wrote like a cantata every week. It was ridiculous. And it's funny because Bach right now is known for, his counterpoint. So, Art of the Fugue and Musical Offering. He's known for the concerti, so the violin concertos and the Brandenburg concertos. He's known for his solo works, so the violin partitas and the cello suites. And then he's known for a lot of piano music, and he's known for the big things. So, the Johannes Passion, the Mass in B minor, the Well-Tempered Clavier. Obviously, that's a piano thing, but it's also a big thing. But I think that the cantatas really are, they're not necessarily the best Bach. If anything could be called the best Bach, all of it's good. But they are definitely the most representative of Bach, I think. From what little I know about Bach's life, from what little I know about Bach as a person and as a composer, the cantatas seem to me to be the clearest distillation of his deal. Outside of the really, really contrapuntal stuff, which I think you can argue is also, it's a different side of Bach, but it's also his deal in a way. Now, the cantatas are, what is a cantata, right? That's the obvious question to ask. So a cantata is, so first of all, there's a choir. So it's choir and it's instruments. And for the most part, it's a choir and a couple of soloists. Not all of them have choir, maybe, I'm not totally sure. All the ones I listened to had choir. So there's choir, there's soloists, and there's instruments. And the entire thing is structured, it's similar in length to any sonata form work, so it's typically between, a little shorter, it's anywhere between 15 and 35 minutes. The ones I listened to are probably about 20 each. The one was only like 12, so very, very short. Anyways, these cantatas are structured in a very specific way. So they're all based on religious texts. Some of them are taken directly from, old-timey religious texts. Some of them are translations and abridgments and kind of weird, and no one knows who wrote them. But they're all religious texts, at least the ones I listened to. Obviously, there are some secular cantatas, but most of the cantatas, he wrote like 300 of them in his life or something ridiculous. Like 200 of them are extant. Most of them are religious, and they're a very specific kind of religion, right? They are this German Protestant, I am a sinner, Lord save me type of Christianity, which I think makes for great music. Like the opening of the Johannes Passion is the best depiction of, just complete supplication you're ever going to see. So there is some really, really good stuff that you can get out of that whole emotional space. And Bach gets it all out in the cantatas. Like, the cantatas are just one enormous tapestry of Protestant supplication in the best way possible. Now, these 4 cantatas I listened to are the first 4 cantatas of his second set. I'll put a link to the specific BWV numbers in the description, but suffice it to say, these are the start of his big cycle, and these are all June of 24, I think. I'll add an errata if that's wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's June of 24, 1724, that is. And he wrote 4 cantatas in the space of 1 month. This was a pattern for him. He continued this on and on and on. So the way they're structured, right, there's a big choral thing at the start. Then there's a bunch of little sections. So some of them are recitatives, basically. So it's basically a soloist with minimal background music, and they're just kind of sing-speaking, sort of. I mean, it's more elaborate than an opera sing-speaking sort of thing, but not that much. So it's very much like recitative and like an old-timey mass. Then you've got, after the recitative, you've got arias. So they're offset by one another. There's some recitatives, there's arias, and they trade one to another. The arias are quite good. Like, it's surprising. You don't think of Bach as a very lyrical writer. At least I don't. I think of him as a very dense, contrapuntal writer most of the time. He's a great lyrical writer when he wants to be. He's, like, as good as any of the other Baroque lyrical writers. I personally don't think the Baroque style suits lyrical writing, the late Baroque style, I mean, as well as, say, the style of Monteverdi or, the Romantics, or even Mozart, for example, I think was more well-suited to lyrical style. Bach does a great job with it. He's got great melodies, he's got great tunes, and most of all, there's this constant sense of yearning that any good religious cantata's got to have, and he's got it in spades. Then at the ending, there's a chorale. So the chorales are just about a minute. They're oftentimes, I'll bet you most of the time, they're pilfered from other sources. They're just kind of little things with lots of counterpoint. The fun fact, the last chorale of the 4th is the same chorale that Paul Simon used for American Tune. And there's actually an interview with him with Dick Cavett from a long time ago, I think like 72 something, really, really long time ago. But he talks about writing Bridge Over Troubled Water, and he mentions it there also. And he even plays a little bit of just the Bach cantata. So I think there are other Bach cantatas that also share this melody, so this is by no means necessarily the one Paul Simon listened to, but it's still quite interesting because you hear American Tune very clearly. The big showpiece, though, is the opening movements. They're called choruses, I think is the English translation commonly used. Like I said, I think like the opening chorus to the Johannes Passion is like the greatest thing Bach ever wrote, and one of the greatest pieces, maybe the greatest piece of choral music ever written. So, okay, Monteverdi's pretty good too, but okay, really, really good stuff. But the choruses, even in these little cantatas, even when they're only like 5 minutes long, they're really, really good music. Like, every single one of them, you can set your watch by it. So, I mean, I would just recommend, it doesn't have to be these 4 cantatas, it can be any cantata, but put on a chorus from a Bach cantata, and you're going to have fun. So, with that said, let's do a roundup now. I've kind of gotten off track. So, first, Great Gatsby. That's the F. Scott Fitzgerald novel, very famous. It's a work of witty observation, like Twain or Dickens. And it's good stuff. You gotta read The Great Gatsby. Particularly if you are an American. It is like an American classic. And it is worth it. And Gatsby is just such a brilliant, brilliant character. And there was another podcast I listened to recently, Canadian podcast called the Signature Series, where they do a different character for each of the keys. And it's kind of a gimmick, but it's still a lot of fun. And there was one they did, it was B minor, and they did Gatsby as the sort of template for it, and it's just really wonderful. So that's kind of a nice little addendum if you're on a Great Gatsby high and you want something else that's a bit of fun. Okay, then you got the movies. You got Vertigo, which is very well made, it goes places I was not expecting, and I don't entirely think the pacing completely made sense to me, but it's really well made, and I'm definitely going to watch it again because it's a movie I want to love, and I like it, right? So the question is, can I get myself to love it? Next, Inside, Bo Burnham. Good songs. The whole premise seems a little dicey to me, but other people seem to like it, so your mileage may vary on that one. Then then there's the Fall of Civilization podcast, Carthage. Good stuff. Lots of fun little details. It's good not background listening, but it's good listening for when you have some sort of menial task to do. Whether it's, you can't fall asleep, or, you're going for a walk. I don't know. Whatever you like to listen to a podcast during, it's good, because I tend to when I listen to podcasts, they're not always the greatest, most elevated topics on the planet. So it's good to have something that's like good for you, quote unquote, but also just really interesting. Then the music, you've got the Metner Second Piano Concerto. Anyone who likes Rachmaninoff, it's great, and it's not just like Rachmaninoff. You've got these influences of Poulenc, you've got influence, or not, obviously the influences go the other way, because Metner, I think, wrote before anything Poulenc wrote, really. Same thing with the influences, or at least comparisons, to Scriabin. Anyways, then you've also got the Cantatas of Bach. I only listened to, for this podcast, the June 1724 cantatas, and there are 4 of them, so just doing that was like an hour and a half. But all of the cantatas by Bach are great stuff. And, you can listen to any one of them. The chorus is going to be good. There's going to be good melodies in the aria. You're going to have a chorale that's got just really nice, tight part writing. So that's going to be the end in this podcast. That's all I've got for you. I'll be back in the future. I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet, so we'll see what that ends up being. But yeah, there's been a lot of good stuff. All of this stuff's been really quite good in the last week, so I've been quite pleased with what I've stumbled upon. So until I see you again, au revoir.